Good evening to all of you that are currently on the line. We've got a couple of more minutes before the webinar is scheduled to begin and a few more people to join. So if you'd like to just sit tight while we wait for your colleagues to log in, I would very much appreciate it. And we'll try to get started promptly at 6:30. So thank you for your efficient joining and logging in. And just stay tuned. I'll be back with you shortly. Okay, once again, good evening all at 6:30. So I think we'll go ahead and get started. We have a few more people that will likely be joining us, but certainly want to start on time so we can end on time. Once again, my name is Angie Irwin, as many of you know, and I am honored to be representing Lake Superior State University through this webinar series, this 2018-2019 ESP series, and through this webinar discussion tonight. I want to wish all of you a happy new year. I hope you had a beautiful and festive holiday season, and I hope your 2019 has gotten off to a great start. And I'm just thrilled to be kicking off the first month of the year in this webinar with all of you. So again, for those of you on the line, welcome. I trust we'll have many more joiners as we move forward, and hopefully they'll pick up where we leave off. So again, as I have done in the past, let me just start this webinar with a few housekeeping mentions. Number one, I want to thank Lake Superior State University, as I always try to do, for bringing this professional development opportunity to all of you. We have a couple of Lake Superior State University staff represented on the line on our webinar this evening. So as with past practice, I will refer to them and their specific approaches and philosophies on the work that they do relative to our subject this evening. So welcome to them. I saw specifically Brooke and Julie had logged in, so welcome to Brooke and Julie. Unfortunately, Chris Oshelski couldn't be with us this evening, but he is well represented by his staff. So again, thanks to Lake Superior State University for bringing this to us. Another housekeeping item, this webinar, as with past webinars, is being recorded. So know that as we move forward in our discussion this evening, but also know that for future reference and future access for both you and your board colleagues that are not able to join us this evening. Lake Superior State University will post this webinar as it with past webinars on their website, and we always try to do that as timely as possible. So hopefully within the next few days after we get the recording in order, I'll send it to Lake State. They'll get it posted on their site, and it will be available for your future use and reference. So please take advantage of that. I think that's a great service, especially for, again, your board colleagues that can't be with us this evening. And finally, just a quick review of how you can participate in this webinar, a couple of different ways. As you know, I have an attendees list in front of me on my screen. So I watch that pretty closely for question marks or hand icons. So as I see those next to your name, I will try to remember to unmute you, ask if you have thoughts, feedbacks, questions, or comments, and you should always feel free to share those. And then secondly, you can ask questions, share feedback, comments through the questions pane that you're seeing on your screen this evening as well. I also monitor that throughout the webinar session, so I will get to those questions. If I don't get to them immediately, please know that it's just because I'm probably not in a position where I can break quite as easily, but I will get to them, I promise you. So let me just share with you this evening what we're going to experience in this webinar tonight, which is entitled How Well is Management Performing? Evaluating Your ESP. So tonight is all about how we should be thinking about the evaluation process of our educational service provider, or for those of you that do not have an educational service provider, think about this in terms of school leadership, school administration. The elements that we're going to be talking about tonight are transferable and universal to that specific sole role as well. So think about that, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we get more deeply into the session this evening. So I want to share with you that because it's been a while since we were last together, since last year, I might add, I want to spend the first couple of minutes just reviewing some of those slides that I presented to you during the November 7th webinar, where we discussed how well are you managing your management agreement. I think those will be really helpful in introducing our subject this evening. I think they'll provide for a nice launching pad into our evaluation discussion. So just want to set tonight's conversation up with those review slides, and then we'll move into the subject at hand. I also want to share with you that I tried something a little bit different tonight in the presentation. I have several hyperlinks built into some of the slides, so there'll be a little bit back and forth. Hopefully it will be seamless as we look at documents that will support some of the conversation that we're going to have about ESP evaluations this evening. So those are just a few items I wanted to bring your attention before we begin. So as they say, without further ado, let's get this webinar moving. So as I mentioned, we're first going to spend the first couple of minutes reviewing some slides. And as I've shared with you in past webinars, this is my favorite one to start out with, right? The board of directors is the highest level of leadership. So always I want that to be the backdrop. I want that to be the backdrop for our discussion. I want that to be the backdrop in your minds as we move forward with our conversation this evening. And as I shared with you back in November, I think this is particularly critical when we're discussing this ESP board relationship, because I think sometimes boards can get a little lost in their roles and responsibilities when they have an educational service provider administering and carrying out so much of the administrative functions at the school level. So really important for you to remember that as a board of directors, you are the highest level of leadership. And I want you to understand a couple of things with respect to that. And I don't know if I've shared this, but I feel compelled to share it tonight. That this is not my philosophy. This is not my opinion. This is the reality of the structure under which you operate, right? So we talked a little bit about that in the last session, the authority that you've been given legislatively to govern over the schools over which you're governing, right? So legislation has put you in a position that you have, remember we talked about this, sovereign authority over the schools that you have chosen to govern for. So this again is not my opinion, not my philosophy, not Lake State's opinion, not its philosophy. It is the reality of the structure. So again, just keep that in mind as we move through these slides this evening. And bear with me, I might have a question here. So I just want to make sure I open up this question pane and see. So please, just a moment. I do know that we have a few that were sure. Okay. Okay, no problem. That was just a comment that someone wanted to share. So I apologize for that. I wanted to make sure I got that opened up. So board of directors, highest level of leadership. Keep that in mind as we move through this evening's webinar. So remember when we gathered in November, we talked about this alignment relationship between the services agreement between you and your educational service provider, or I'm just going to say ESP from this point forward, and the charter performance contract. And we talked about alignment not in terms of verbatim language, obviously. We talked about alignment in ensuring that your services agreement and particularly your relationship with your ESP aligns with what is expected of you relative to the goals, the provisions that are emphasized in your charter performance contract. So ensuring that any management company you use understands that there are expectations that are outlined in that charter performance contract that because of their subordinate relationship to you, they are expected to help you achieve, either meet or exceed. So that's the alignment piece that we talked about during our last session in November. So wanted to raise that again because obviously as we talk about evaluating your ESP, we want to talk about evaluating them against the services that they have promised to provide and against the expectations and desired outcomes that you're going to agree upon with them relative to those services to get you to charter performance contract performance. Okay, hopefully that makes sense to you. We also talked about the notion of you as board functioning in that supervisory role to that services agreement. So really thinking about the parallels of this relationship to what we all know, right? To maybe an employer-employee relationship, a supervisor subordinate relationship. However you want to think about that relative to your role as the highest level of leadership for the academy over which you govern is what we're trying to emphasize here. But really what I was trying to make clear is that regardless of what you might think or what the ESP might think, remember the law suggests that you have authority over this school over which you govern. Therefore, you have authority over everything that happens at that school and every relationship that you enter into for and on behalf of that school. So that is a supervisory authority, a supervisory role. And that's what we talked about in November when we shared this slide. And then finally, when we met in November, we also talked about, okay, when we think about the role of the supervisor, how does it parallel with my role as a board relative to the ESP that we have engaged to administer our school? So this was a pretty clear definition relative to that relationship. You are an overseer, which we all know, right? And your main responsibility is to ensure that certain things happen, and these certain things are performance, right? To to ensure that your service provider is performing in a timely, quality, cost productive, and satisfactory manner, and within the parameters of the job, within the parameters of those services that they promised to perform when you hired them to service your school. Okay, so that was the role of the supervisor. So those are the few slides that I just wanted to bring forth this evening to again set us up nicely for what will be an evaluation conversation. And hopefully you see why it was important to bring those back, to resurface those, because as we move into this conversation around evaluation, please understand that as a good supervisor, as good leaders, you have a responsibility to evaluate your contractors, to evaluate your most critical contractor, which in this case, within this structure, is your ESP. So hopefully, again, that all makes sense to you. So as we look at evaluating your ESP, and again, we talked about this in November, I touched upon it a little bit this evening. The critical question is, what did you hire management to do, right? What did you hire your ESP to do? And remember, when we met in November, I shared with you that you have a responsibility to become very acquainted with that services agreement intimately, because it's your responsibility to understand what the expectations are relative to the services to be provided, that it should be outlined within that services agreement. So understanding what you hired management to do for the purposes of our conversation tonight is critical, because if you don't understand the services that they are to be providing, on what are you going to evaluate them when it comes time to evaluate them or evaluate it, your educational service provider or your ESP. So generally speaking, I think we can really put those services into four broad categories, right? Number one, impact educational environment through teaching and learning, right? So you've hired them to provide the resources, right? We've talked about this many times. We're going to talk about it again tonight, to provide those inputs, those resources to the academy that will lend themselves to an effective teaching and learning environment. Okay, so number one, you've maybe hired them to safeguard with you taxpayers' dollars. So I'm certain to say in here, in cooperation with the board, right? Because you have a responsibility to protect the taxpayers' dollars. Your ESP helps you do that by providing the right documentation on financial transparency, okay? You hire them to help preserve a conducive learning climate and culture. And or you've hired them to effectively operate the school. So I understand not all boards have a management relationship that covers all four of these categories. So that's why they're broad, because regardless of whether or not you use a full service provider, or for example, you use an HR company, you've hired them to impact the educational environment, right? So there's still an evaluation relationship that could transpire there. You might just use someone to help you with the finances, to provide those reports. Well, they're helping you safeguard those taxpayers' dollars. So again, there could be an evaluation consideration there with that contract within that relationship. Effectively operating the school, preserving a conducive learning climate and culture, that comes generally speaking in sort of that full service context. But my point is here, regardless of what you use management for or a company for within the context of one, two, three, or all four of these, you should still be talking to them about how well they're doing in those areas. And we're going to talk about what that might look like given these four broad areas in our next few slides. So how do you know if management is performing well? Two typical ways, right? Through monthly assurance reporting. So this is at the board meeting when on the agenda we see the management report, right? So this is management sharing with you whatever it is management is sharing with you through that reporting relationship, and then formal evaluations. What I want to emphasize here is this, because the next few slides are going to speak to this. I want you to rethink or reconsider how management is reporting to you on a monthly basis. And I want you to do that in the context of using the information that's being shared at the monthly meetings to inform a formal evaluation process on an annual basis. So, what do I mean by that? I want you to think about your monthly meetings and the management report in terms of key performance indicators or KPIs. So remember, you've hired management to do one, two, three, or all four of these things. In that services agreement, they're sharing with you what it is they're going to be providing, what services they're going to be providing. So it's only fair then that their management report on a monthly basis speaks to how well they're performing those services, right? So I'm sure if I was with you right now, I would ask, by way of hands, how many of you after a board meeting walk away and think that was a pretty good meeting, but I'm still not sure how we're doing in some of these areas, right? And I'm sure several hands would go up, because a management report is basically an inputs report, right? It's sharing with you sort of what's happening. Maybe there are some agreements that you need to sign. Maybe there's some contracts that they're bringing forth for certain reasons. Maybe they're sharing with you some details about the facility, whatever that might look like, etc. I want you to really think about those management reports and your monthly meetings becoming more meaningful and more relevant. And one way to do that is to structure them so they're speaking to what exactly that services relationship looks like. So I've broken down for you on this slide, on this page, what you might want to be thinking about relative to those key performance indicators, which from this point forward, I'm going to refer to as KPIs. So these are just sample ideas. If you have other ideas, add them. You can subtract. If you feel like, yep, I'm on board with this, I want to take this, I want to discuss this with management and or school leadership, and I want to develop these monthly reporting practices. Just, you can either use what's here, or if you want to give me a call or pop me an email at some point after this webinar and say, hey, Angie, can you send me X, Y, and Z? I'm happy to do that, okay? But the whole idea is, take what you have, what you see here, if you feel this is important to you, and just make adjustments accordingly relative to your services relationship, relative to your environment. So we've got educational environment, right? So that's the teaching and learning, sort of the first dimension that we talked about on the previous slide. So what KPIs really impact the educational environment? What do we want to know as a board about the educational environment? We want to know if our students are growing and if they're proficient, right? We want to know what that cohort data is looking like. Then relative to that student growth and proficiency, we want to know what the subgroup data is looking like relative to that student growth and proficiency. We want to know if we're preparing our students for college and career readiness, right? So looking at that college prep data information. We want to know if we're working toward our mission. I would ask you, again, I can't do it quite as easily on a webinar. I would ask you how many of you have developed mission-specific goals. That is, looking at your mission and then developing goals that help you understand if you're at any point in time achieving your mission. So again, we won't get into that, but if anybody has any questions relative to those mission specific goals, don't hesitate to call or follow up with me. But mission specific data, what does that look like? Subject data, at-risk program data. Now, we talked a little bit about this in prior webinars, and I think it was maybe the communications webinar that I facilitated last year, where I said to you, and I've heard this a lot from boards, from management, where it's hard to give educational environment data or academic data at every board meeting because assessments only are administered certain times of the year, right? So we don't always have data. I'm using air quotes. You can't see that, but we don't always have clear data to share. What these KPIs suggest is even outside of those formal assessments, there should be data that speaks to climate and culture. Now, we have climate and culture here, and then I have climate and culture as a broad category. Climate and culture here is, generally speaking, how is our climate and culture impacting the educational environment, right? So that's a more general approach to climate and culture. Student mobility and attrition. You know, there's in some schools there's sort of this continuous inflow and outflow of students. So what is that looking like? Leadership mobility attrition. What is that looking like? Facility safety and security. So there are other things that impact the educational environment and academic outcomes outside of those formal assessments. And that's what I'm trying to emphasize with those last 4 KPIs that you see on the list. So just understand that. Second dimension, and I refer to these as dimensions, so you'll see that a little bit later. The second dimension is finances. So what you might want to be thinking about there is what is it about our fund allocation that we need to be thinking about. So, for example, are we allocating enough funds toward our mission, or are all of our funds going toward our mission or in support of our mission, right? So that's what we're talking about with fund allocation. Fund to balance. Do we have a fund to balance goal? What's our fund balance looking like? Budget. How is the budget process going, for example? And what, excuse me for just a minute, please. It looks like I might have another question, although I'm not seeing it in the questions pane, but I see a hand. So let me just take a minute here and see who might have a hand up. Oh, okay. Julie, I see you have your hand up. Julie Hopper from Lake Superior State University. Looks like she might have a question. So I'm going to unmute Julie and see if she has a question or comment to share. So Julie, it looks like you've muted yourself. So if you want to unmute and ask your question or share your thoughts or comments, that'd be great. Are you there, Julie? Julie, can you hear me? Julie, I'm not getting a sound from you. So as soon as I hear your voice, I'll cut out and certainly allow you to share your thoughts or ask your questions. I'll continue on, but just feel free to interrupt me when you have a question that you are able to articulate through the audio. So the other finance KPI is budget. I think I was talking about that. I'm sorry, I got a little distracted. So budget. Are we budgeting in timely ways? Is our budget process meeting the required timelines? Is the budget process providing for input from staff? Are we, the board, a part of that budgeting process, right? This is a process. So that's a KPI that you're going to want to think about under finances. Audit. Are our audits timely? Are they clean? And then this is, that whole notion of transparency. That's sort of the overarching, I think, KPI for all of this finance area. And that is the ESP, and I'll say ESP, school leader, whatever that might look like, is he or they or it transparent in reporting to us the financial position of the school? Are they transparent with the funds? Are they transparent with what they're giving us in terms of financial reporting? Is that clear? Are we able to ask wise questions from that information that they're sharing with us? So that's those are the indicators for the finances, those KPIs that we talked about for the finances. And then moving on to climate and culture, you can see the KPIs listed there, things like chronic absenteeism or just absenteeism in general. Hopefully it's not chronic, but if it is, it deserves even more attention. Student, staff, parent engagement, suspension, expulsions, social, emotional skills. Now, again, these all support climate and culture, right? Special education, respect for diversity, school participation, physical safety, physical environment, academic environment. Again, we've sort of exchanged information between the educational environment, climate and culture and academic environment, wellness and relationships. So those are just a few climate culture KPIs that you might want to consider in that reporting relationship. And finally, operations. And when I think of operations, I think of things like technology service, sort of infrastructure stuff, right? Technology services, food services, maintenance services, teacher effectiveness, school leadership effectiveness, marketing enrollment, exterior services, compliance reporting. Julie, are you ready to ask your question?
I am. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I sure can.
Oh, wonderful. I have to apologize. I am multitasking this evening, shuffling kids to basketball and things like that. So I think I could hear you, but you couldn't hear me. So I apologize.
No
Um,
problem. No problem.
okay, I just wanted to interject, a lot of the things you were saying as far as the educational environment. I've finally completed my tour of presenting to all of the boards their annual report from last year, which I can't believe it's December, January when I finished that, but
Right.
it takes a long time to get to everyone. And I just wanted to give a heads up while I had this opportunity. I'll be sending out a memo. Actually, it will come through Jenny Peterman, and it was going to be sent out this week, but it might next week, depending on when Jenny's feeling better. But I've been letting schools know that we are going to ask that they adopt new educational goals. And I just thought that was a good spot for me to let them know. They should know. I've presented to everyone. I've explained why, why it's necessary, why it's a positive. But a really exciting piece of that is what you were saying. There's more to evaluating academic performance than just test scores. And we've really had that discussion recently. Brooke and I have been talking about this a lot, and Chris, in our office. And so what we're going to ask, we allow academies to have academy-specific goals under Measure 4 of their educational goals. Yeah, and we really want to encourage them to, measure, find creative ways to measure kind of like a whole child perspective. And so it's not just academics, but maybe look at some other things, whether it's less referrals, whether they're meeting the mission of their academy, but to really utilize that Measure 4 and think creatively on what's important to them. And Brooke, I don't know if you wanted to add to that, or I'm putting you on the spot, Brooke, but maybe not. But needless to say, I will be. Please look for that, and there's directions. We'll ask you to adopt a new resolution and complete a couple portions of the educational goals. So Measure 1, 2, and 3 are set, but you have the freedom to, of course, have your mission and then add to Measure 4. So just wanted to give everyone a heads up, and also say thank you, Angie, and thank you to everyone for listening in this evening.
Thank you so much, Julie. And that's perfect timing because obviously, as we look at evaluating the ESP, you're going to want to board, obviously, have conversation with them around those educational goals because they're to help you achieve them, as we talked about. So, really, really great timing. Thanks so much, Julie.
Oh, thank
Really
you.
helpful.
Great, thank you.
Very good. So you're welcome. So as we look at, again, the operations KPIs, you see some of those listed there. We talk about teacher effectiveness, school leadership effectiveness, as I was talking about marketing enrollment, exterior services, and compliance reporting. So those are really all what I consider to be operational services that your ESP is to be providing. So you're probably looking at this and thinking, okay, that's great, but what about it, right? How do we transfer this information into a monthly reporting relationship? So this is sort of step one, right? Identifying those KPIs. Step two then is taking each of those KPIs, breaking them down, having conversation, right, with your ESP about the expectations relative to each of those and or the desired outcomes. So you see this is, we've just transferred those KPIs, for example, from educational environment, put them into this slide that's before you this evening, and then are asking you to develop then in conjunction with your ESP what you should be expecting relative to those KPIs, what you should be expecting in terms of those outcomes. And you've got documents to help you with this. Obviously, you've got your charter performance contract. You have your services agreement. You even have things like board policy that we don't always consider. But remember, your board policy, especially if you use a comprehensive policy service that the Institute, the National Charter Schools Institute provides, your board policy should outline some of these details for you. So don't forget about board policy and referring to those relative to those KPIs that we're talking about this evening. So don't don't forget those when you look at these. You've got your school improvement plan. Maybe there's something about the school improvement plan that could be helpful in the expectations, desired outcomes conversation. You have any administrative guidelines, procedures. Again, that's the institute services, and those might be helpful relative to your understanding of what administration is providing with respect to these environmental components. So again, and then certainly any academic accountability plans that have been provided to you by your authorizer. So when you look at some of these elements, understand that you don't always have to start from scratch, that you've got those reference tools, those resources to help you. So again, educational environment, expectations, desired outcomes. And we're going to go through each of these. You've got finances. So we've just outlined the KPIs in the full slide that I shared with you. They're broken down in this slide. So what are your expectations, desired outcomes relative to fund allocation? What are your expectations, desired outcomes relative to fund balance, budget, audit, transparency? Articulate those through a document similar to what you see in front of you this evening. Climate culture, same thing. So you see these for each of these areas. So I do encourage you to use these because the next step that we're going to be talking about shortly is then how are you board going to measure this during that monthly reporting agenda item. So we'll talk about that in a moment. But you see all those climate culture KPIs referenced on this sheet in front of you. So same thing, expectation, desired outcomes. You know what? I should probably stop for a minute and just ask any of you right now if you have any questions so far. I'm sorry, I just kind of keep going and forget to ask that. So let me stop and just give you a minute to sort of formulate any thoughts, comments, questions in your minds, and just by either hand, question mark, or through the questions pane. Mhm. So I did get one question. How do you measure student, staff, parent engagement? So some of these, I'm just going to tell you that not all of these are what you would call quantifiable, right? But I still think they're important relative to the environment, right? Whatever that might look like. So how do you think about student, staff, parent engagement? What's what's the community, the school community, what's the tenor, right, of the community? What's the relationship between student staff? How is that behavior working? Are parents coming to the school? Are they participating in events? Are they coming to parent-teacher conferences? You should have record of that, or somebody should have record of that. If the board wants to know and understand that, then certainly ask for that. Um, what's the level of engagement of staff relative to in classroom behavior, and how, so some of that, staff behavior, for example, staff engagement might be shown through things like staff evaluations, and we're going to talk a little bit about those in the next slide. So that could be a component as they're observed through that staff evaluation process. Staff engagement might be something that the school leader is looking at as it's representing the ESP in that relationship. Student engagement, any teacher should be able to answer that. And again, through those staff evaluations, that's something that observers are generally looking at. Are the students engaged? Are they participating? So this is the student staff piece is pretty classroom specific, and you can find that out through the evaluations likely. Parent engagement is just like I said. Are parents attending events? Are they coming to parent teacher conferences? Are they volunteering in the classroom? Again, what is that level looking like? You don't need to know all the detail of that. But with respect to climate and culture, what board are your expectations? So this is what you have to be thinking about. What are my expectations relative to student, staff, parent engagement? Is the ESP delivering on those expectations? And then how are we going to ensure that those expectations continue and are consistent? So I hope that makes sense. So here's another question. Somebody asked if I'm asking if you should be looking at or viewing staff evaluations. I know this is a little bit of a tenuous conversation, right? So I'm going to say this. When you're looking, if climate and culture is important to you, which as a board, I'm sure that it is, and you want to really think about what a holistic climate, culture, environment should look like, then I would say to you, you need to ensure that staff is supporting the kind of climate and culture that you're expecting at the school over which you're governing. One way to recognize and understand that is through those staff evaluation outcomes. Do you need to view them? I'm not sure that you need to look at every staff evaluation. Maybe the expectation is that the board would like to see some kind of culminating report on staff effectiveness that might get to some of these climate cultural conversations. So that's what I'm suggesting with respect to staff evaluations. I hope that makes sense. That was another one of the questions that was asked. So I think I got, should this be done at a board meeting or subcommittee? So all the reporting, one of the questions they asked is, should this be done at a board meeting or subcommittee? So what I'm suggesting here is that these services that your ESP has promised to provide are listed here in some way, shape, or form, right? Together, you're going to reach some kind of consensus on expectations or desired outcomes. Once you do that, then the monthly reporting of management, so the management report is now going to focus on these areas, right? And those can be managed however you deem appropriate, right? If you want to work with management to set up some kind of report that you can get as part of your board packet, fine, whatever you choose to do there. But what I'm suggesting is, as you look at these KPIs for each of these core dimensions, that your monthly meetings then speak to those services and to those outcomes based on those expectations that you've now articulated through this kind of format that we're discussing. So that's what I'm suggesting. I hope that answered the question. So I think I'm still looking through the questions. Okay. Good. I think that was it for the questions so far, and I'll certainly take a break again and allow you to answer those. And let me just say this: I know some of you might be a little bit nervous about micromanagement, or you might be a little bit nervous about, wow, do we really need to know all of this? I get that. Remember two things. These are sample KPIs. You can customize these however you deem appropriate and necessary, however they best align to your environment, however they best suit the relationship between you as a board and your ESP. So I'm not saying you need to use all of these. I mentioned that earlier. I wanted to emphasize it again. What I'm saying is you have a responsibility to ensure certain things are happening at the school. You have a responsibility to ensure that certain expectations are being met, that certain outcomes are being achieved. What I'm suggesting to you is that your responsibility really covers four key areas: educational environment, financial environment, climate cultural environment, and operational environment. I would think that as a board, those are areas that you would take a keen interest, if indeed, now again, I'll qualify that by saying, if indeed they're what's being promised as services to be performed through that services agreement. Okay, so that's what I'm suggesting here. And finally, the last slide, if I can get to it, operations. So we talked about this. I should say technology services, not technology and services, but so I apologize for that. So all of those things we talked about: technology services, food services, maintenance services. Okay, I'm going to stop right here. Teacher effectiveness, school leadership effectiveness. So we talked a little bit just now about teacher effectiveness relative to student staff engagement. We're going to talk a little bit more about school leadership effectiveness relative to school leadership evaluation. So there's one of the last slides. Brooke from Lake Superior State University is going to talk to you about what's required of management relative to administering those school leadership evaluations, okay? So she's going to mention that a few slides on from now. What I want, so a lot of times the question is surfaced of how can we evaluate as a board school leadership? So I say to you that if you don't employ the school leader, it's not your responsibility to evaluate the school leader specifically. However, you do employ the company that employs the school leader. So as part of that evaluation process, that more comprehensive evaluation process, you should be looking at school leadership, and school leadership in terms of not just the effectiveness, but also how how are we recruiting? Are we retaining? Are we developing quality school leadership? So that's how one way that you can get to the indirect evaluation of school leadership by evaluating the company that you've hired to resource the school with leaders and teachers. Okay, I hope that makes sense. I know there's been a real lack of clarity around that over the past, well, 25 years since I've been doing this work. So this isn't a new question, but just understand that that's my overall general position on that. And one way, again, you can look at school leadership effectiveness. So wanted to put that out there. But in a few slides, we'll kind of pass it over to Brooke, and she can talk a little bit more about what's required of management in terms of those school leadership evaluations. So you've broken down all those KPIs, you've articulated the expectations, the desired outcomes through this format. Now, in a board meeting, so now we're in a board meeting, right? We're in a board meeting and management is going to be reporting on those KPIs just as we discussed. So remember, I put this bubble slide up here, the inputs, the academy resources, the outputs, the delivery on the resources. You as a board are most concerned with the outcomes. So here's the first hyperlink that I'm going to try to bring up for you, which didn't work that time. So let's just go back. So bear with me as I do this. It worked earlier. So what you're going to see now is just a quick Excel spreadsheet, hopefully, that addresses those KPIs that we just discussed, but in sort of a really clear dashboard format. So one moment, here it is. So you see you've got the KPIs up here, and you've got just these quick stoplights, right? Green, yellow, and red. So the idea here from the board's perspective is, let's say you're going to use this. So you're going to take student growth and proficiency. In here then, right here, as I've highlighted, you will have the expectations transferred over, right, from the document you just created, or you'll just have that in front of you. And so now the report from management is going to speak to how well we're working toward those desired outcomes or how well we're achieving those expectations. So if you go down to the bottom of this dashboard, you're going to see just a little legend. So really simple. The green, discussed, we're on track. The yellow, discussed and slightly behind on progress. The red, we discussed and no progress is being made. So simply, you go in, student growth and proficiency, looks like the management leadership. Now, remember, again, let me just back up. When I talk about management, when I talk about the ESP, I'm including school leadership in that conversation. So some of you might be saying, yeah, but our school leader reports on all of that. Yes, your school leader is part of management, right? Your school leader is the ESP as well. So just understand that position. So you're going to go in and you're going to talk about student growth, and you're going to say, yep, that looks good. So we're going to just take out these dots. We've got a green there. We're going to talk about cohort data. Maybe we're working toward achieving that, but we're not quite there yet. So we're going to give that a yellow for this board meeting. And you're going to keep these meeting by meeting. These are just, again, examples, samples, right? So you're going to keep these meeting by meeting, and then you'll see toward the end of the year, after having done this, you'll have a good sense of all the effectiveness of that ESP based on these monthly reports that you're now administering on a regular basis. So that's essentially how I suggest that those work. So now we're going to go back to the presentation. Oh, I see one moment, please. Looks like there's a question. I see a hand up. Okay, excuse me, I'm just looking. I have to go through the questions pane to get to the most current question. So I'm doing that. Oh, somebody asked if you received this great template. Yes, I will share with you. It will, all of this will be posted on LSSU's site. Good question on the template. What I'll do for the template, if any of you are interested in that dashboard template, just email me and I'll share that with you, because these hyperlinks can be a little stubborn sometimes. So I'm not sure if once the PowerPoint is posted on LSU's website that the hyperlinks will work. So just as we go through these hyperlinks, just email me anything you'd like, and I'm happy to send it to you. So generally speaking, that's what new monthly reporting might look like relative to that ESP board relationship. So understand that. Now you're well prepared based on that new reporting relationship to enter into a formal evaluation process. So that's what we're going to talk about next. So we've gone through this monthly informal reporting that is evaluatory in a sense, but now we're moving into that annual formal evaluation process, which your authorizer, like Superior State University, is strongly encouraging you to undertake. In fact, I know that you have a template, I believe, that they've provided to you that you're welcome to customize, or that you should, just as I've shared with you relative to that relationship. So now, based on that monthly reporting, you can enter into a fair and transparent evaluation process. So I'm going to walk through these hyperlinks with you. These are more templates that I'm providing to you. So let's just move through those. So, for a fair and transparent process, the first thing that I'm suggesting is that you document, codify, institutionalize your evaluation process. So, what do I mean by this? This means that as a board, you might want to think about adopting a narrative, formal, documented process for your own consistency relative to the evaluation process, but also for any successor board members to use beyond you. So this is just an example of an evaluation process that I've crafted that I have presented to my customer board. So I'll just walk through it briefly with you. First couple paragraphs are just introductory narrative in nature, but then we get into the body of the process. So first is, why do we evaluate? So this is just a general reminder of why you as a board are even undertaking this evaluation process of your ESP. So 4 reasons that are listed within this document. We evaluate to determine overall performance against contractual and board established goals. We evaluate to demonstrate both the board's and ESP's commitment to accountability. We evaluate to encourage meaningful dialogue between and among the board and its ESP team, and we evaluate to ensure that any gaps in performance are filled before it's too late. So those are 4 key reasons why we're even evaluating our ESP. So the next section, so we've got the why, the next section is who. So who evaluates? And again, you can structure this however you choose to, narratively speaking. So what I've seen works best in an evaluation process is every board member will participate in the evaluation process, and then the ESP may evaluate itself as well. And then you come together and you talk about how each of you evaluated under the categories that we're going to talk about here momentarily. So that's the who. How was the evaluation conducted? This is where you're going to outline what evaluation tool maybe you're going to complete, and within what kind of time frame. You can read there, hopefully you can read what's in front of you. So you're going to talk about, okay, how are we going to meet it? How are we going to meet on this? Is the entire board and management going to meet in a workshop scheduled annually? Are we going to meet, in a retreat? Are we going to meet at a board meeting? How is this working? So that's the how. The next is the what. What are the elements of the evaluation? And consistent with our discussion tonight and what I'm presenting to you, I have 4 dimensions, four four dimensions listed there, and we've talked about those: educational environment, finance, climate, culture, operations, and finally, what are the process steps? So what steps will we undertake to ensure that the evaluation begins and ends in a meaningful way? So here I've listed out process steps. We're going to review evaluation content and make any necessary adjustments. We're going to complete the evaluation questionnaire and or instrument electronically if you so desire, and individually. We're going to compile the results. We're going to schedule a meeting to share the results, and then we're going to develop an action plan for performance focus for upcoming year. But in the bold, you see some bolded language there. I'm suggesting so all of you might know by now that I'm a huge proponent of action plans, right? I use action plans for a lot of my work. I've shared templates with a lot of groups as well for their work. So I'm suggesting here that to ensure the process, the evaluation process, begins and ends in a timely manner, that you really think about action planning that out. So that's going to be the next document in our presentation. So really simple action plan that is just going to lay out timing considerations, instrument considerations, final process, and action items. So you'll see in the first section, finalize evaluation tool. So you're going to type in here maybe what's the action item here? Well, you're going to maybe gather all possible evaluation tools and review. Okay, due date. Well, maybe 2 weeks from now. So let's say 2/1/19. What are the action steps? So this is where you're going to say we're going to, review all possibilities. I'm just plugging in information. You can be more specific here. We're going to then modify, right? Modify the tool according to fit and interests, for example. So you see how that works, etc. Whose responsibility is it to maybe complete this item? Maybe it's the board president. So we're going to plug that in. Progress and comments here, I just say, done or in progress, waiting for, whatever that might look like. So you see, this is just a really simple action planning document. You can really use this for anything. I pretty much use the same format, might make adjustments according to the project, but generally speaking, use the same format. And then you're going to get, so that's, you're going to finalize the evaluation tool, you're going to administer the evaluation tool, and you're going to finalize process and action items. So I think this is just really important to demonstrate your commitment to the process and to articulate through writing, through formal documentation, what the expectations are relative to the work to be done and the timing of the work. So you want to be sure that you start and end an evaluation process within a reasonable time frame. You don't want to start your evaluation process, launch into it haphazardly in September, and then in May realize, oops, we never finished that, and then resurrect it and start readdressing some of these items. So this is just to keep you on track, on pace. That's what I'm trying to say about an action plan. So again, if anybody wants a copy of this, don't hesitate to let me know. And then we've got the agreed upon evaluation instrument. So I know, as I mentioned, that Lake Superior State University has provided you with a template. So I'm just sharing with you the template that I've created relative to everything we've talked about this evening. So in addition to being a proponent of action plans, I'm also a person who loves context and narrative. So this whole first section of the evaluation instrument really tries to lay out some context. So the structure, what's the legal arrangement under which we're organized? So what even qualifies us as a board to evaluate management? So that's what the first paragraph is addressing. The second paragraph speaks, okay, generally speaking, from that services agreement, what is the ESP to be providing? So specifics about administrative responsibilities, right? What's the term of the services agreement look like? You might want to plug that in there. Here we get to the relationship and what is it that the board is trying to establish, right? And ensure. And here I'm saying that you have a responsibility as the board as the highest level of leadership to ensure to your authorizer and to ensure to yourselves as a governing body that academic outcomes are being achieved, taxpayers' dollars are being safeguarded, the climate and culture are conducive to learning, and all operational services requirements are satisfied. So all of those things that we've talked about this evening. So talk about, just this relationship, this monthly assurance reporting. We talked about the dimensions. This is where the next section you're going to outline the dimensions of the evaluation, and these are consistent with what we've talked about this evening. What kind of scale are you going to use? I refer to a Likert scale, and you'll see when we get into the instrument itself what that scale formally looks like. I referenced it here. And here we talk about, okay, what documents are we going to use to help inform these outcomes? And you should have been using these documents, remember, in that monthly reporting relationship when you identify those expectations or desired outcomes. So now we get into the evaluation instrument. So this is where you're going to include your evaluation content. And this is the Likert scale that I was referring to, right? So in mine, we go from strongly agree to strongly disagree with agree, neither agree nor disagree, and disagree in between. So what I'm saying, you'll see that neither agree nor disagree, I have footnoted here. So what I'm saying here is that if you use a scale like this, when making the selection, please support with comments clarifying your response, right? And that shouldn't be as difficult because the next document we're going to take a look at is a rubric. I think that's important as well to help you determine what constitutes strongly agree, neither agree nor disagree, disagree, or strongly disagree. So you see, we've got statements here that all tie back to that monthly reporting, but have really culminated in broader statements about how well the academy is doing, again, within this first dimension relative to the educational environment. So first statement, the academy is meeting or exceeding the educational goals as identified in the charter contract. So you're strongly agreeing with that, agreeing, neither agreeing nor disagreeing, disagreeing, or strongly disagreeing. Now, remember, the ESP is responsible for helping you achieve those goals, meeting or exceeding. So that's why this is an evaluation statement. How well are they doing that? They promise to do that through that services agreement relationship. Are they doing that? You can look back on those monthly reports and they will help you determine if that is happening. And then what other things should be happening to ensure those goals are being satisfied? So again, this is just a sample statement. You can adjust this if you so choose, use this however you'd like, but I think it's important for always, if assessment outcomes are lagging, below average, or substandard, what kinds of reviews are we undertaking or analysis to determine the problem? So one of the things that high-performing schools do without fault is review, re-review, redevelop, reestablish, realign their curriculum. So that's what gets to that second statement. And you can, will not read all of these to you. Again, if you want a copy of this, happy to provide it. You can make the necessary adjustments. But you see, so this is educational environment. We've got evaluation statements for each one of those core dimensions. So we get in dimension 2, we're talking about finances. We've got statements there that help us determine the ESP effectiveness relative to that monthly reporting, climate and culture. And then finally, dimension 4 gets to that operations relationship. So that's essentially the evaluation tool that I've created, that I've used with other groups. So again, if any of you are interested, happy to provide that to you. But I also think, as I just mentioned, it's important for everybody to understand what constitutes those evaluation outcomes. What is it that you're looking at that helps you determine whether or not you strongly agree or strongly disagree? And there, a rubric can be supportive in that area. So here's an accompanying rubric that just outlines, generally speaking, how you can best determine, in conjunction with those monthly reporting outcomes that you now have, that you now understand, how you can determine whether you strongly agree or strongly disagree or anything in between in any of those areas. So the rubric just helps break it down for you. So I'll just, the first one. So the statement, remember the statement is the Academy is meeting or exceeding the educational goals as identified in the Charter Performance Contract. Okay, if that's what's happening, then we strongly agree with that. What constitutes just agree? The Academy has consistently met its educational goals and is operating under a commensurate charter performance contract term length. For example, neither agree nor disagree, we don't know. So we can't evaluate on that. Disagree, it's not meeting. Strongly disagree, it's not meeting, and the Academy's charter performance contract is compromised. So you see how a rubric might be able to help with that. And again, if you want this, take it, but customize it, because maybe there are some adjustments that you need to make relative to these definitions. But just like the evaluation instrument itself, these are broken down. This rubric is broken down by each dimension category. So dimension 1 is our educational environment and aligns with all of those elements in the evaluation instrument. Finances aligns with all of the elements identified in the evaluation instrument. Climate and culture is going to be next. So you see how that works. And then finally, the last one is operations, and all of those are defined through this rubric as well. So my point is here to really support and encourage a fair and transparent evaluation process. Everybody needs to understand on what they're going to be evaluated and what's the criteria that you're going to use to help determine if you strongly agree or strongly disagree with any of the statements on an evaluation instrument. And then what support documentation are you using to identify that criteria? So that's where all that monthly reporting comes into play. So really, I think when you really need to think about the evaluation process as an evaluation package, right? This ultimately becomes your evaluation package. And then finally, this is a different action plan. It's kind of structured the same. But this is where, remember when we looked at the process, the last step on the last page suggested you're going to come together and you're going to identify areas of improvement or areas of focus for the upcoming school year. So on the last page of the evaluation instrument is an action plan that helps address that. So I'm just going to cursor through that. I apologize, there's a few pages to this document, so just bear with me. Hopefully your eyes won't go too crazy as I cursor quickly through these first few pages. But again, this is an important step in the process. So it's right here, discuss comments and action items. So I say this space is reserved to record discussion, comments, and or follow-up needs. Together, management board will determine appropriate follow-up actions and timeframes. The table below may be helpful in follow-up efforts. So you see it's structured similarly to the other action plan, but it's going to get to what are those follow-up areas based on the evaluation outcomes. And then what you can do is through the next year's monthly reporting exercise and practices, incorporate somehow these follow-up items into that monthly reporting. So those are getting tracked through the monthly reporting and then being reincorporated into the next year's formal evaluation process. So that is the final action plan for identifying areas of improvement. So once again, I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to ask if any of you have any questions based on anything you've heard now. Mhm. Brooke, I'm sorry, do you have a question? Okay. Brooke, if you can hear me and you have a question or comment, feel free to unmute. Oh, looks like, I'm sorry. I think
There
I
we go.
had you muted. I'm
Yeah.
sorry.
I
Go
would just like,
ahead, Brooke, if you have a question or comment.
sorry. Thanks, Angie. I just would add that, you know, when we think about these goals and we think about these things, we're so used to hearing for a period of time, there was this push for smart goals, smart goals, smart goals. And, you know,
Mhm.
quantifiable and what they, you know, how they were written, how they were structured. And I think the bigger thing to keep in mind here is that it's a preponderance of evidence, evaluating on preponderance of evidence. And as a school leader, I was constantly bringing a lot of those things we were talking about earlier to my boards through my reporting monthly of, hey, this month we've got, you know, or this quarter we had this many chronic absentees, and this is what we're doing to show that we're stepping towards that. And so those reports can be submitted and actually can be attached to something like Angie provided, so that you would have a preponderance of evidence. So when it says evidence, you don't have to type it all out. You could actually just submit that piece for that evaluation purpose. I know sometimes if you don't have really a good solid evaluation piece in place for your ESP, something like this can be daunting to look at, but it really doesn't have to be totally overwhelming. And just really looking at that, what are they providing us, and how are we, and if they're not providing you with it, it's okay to ask for something along those lines, remembering that, you know, ultimately the buck stops with you as the school, as the board. And so how it's okay to ask for those things.
Mhm. Great. Thank you, Brooke. And Brooke, you might as well stay unmuted because the last slide really addresses that school leader evaluation conversation that I know we've had and I know you want to share with this group tonight. So let me just say, group, remember a few slides ago, I mentioned that the school leader is evaluated through its employer, which in most cases, when an ESP is involved, the employer is the ESP. But there are provisions for the kind of tool that management should use and the process it should undertake for that evaluation that's really being driven by the Michigan Department of Ed. So I think Brooke wants to talk to you a little bit about what that looks like in practice.
Thanks, Angie. And
So go ahead, Brooke. You're welcome.
we've been having these conversations, or I have been, with the school leaders that are participating in our school leadership, ed leadership meetings once a month. And one of the things that's really been kind of a conversation is that there are public acts out there, and I don't know if these actually are hot linked, Angie, in your presentation, but PA Act 170 is talks about, and so Public Act 170 talks about that definition of the teacher and kind of what those evaluation tools are. And the state has kind of outlined 4 choices for teacher evaluation tools. And most schools and most management companies have adopted those tools and kind of stepped into those and really from what I'm hearing and what I'm asking when I'm at schools, we've done a really good job with the teacher evaluation piece. So that's Public Act 170. Public Act 173 talks about that. It talks about the education as well, but it also talks about really, you get into that, the school leader evaluation. And where it gets sticky is for charter schools, we get into a situation where, but whose employee are they? And
Right.
we really get into that of who should be doing the evaluation of the school leader, who shouldn't. And what the law says is that the school board or their designee should be evaluating the superintendent or whoever is in charge of the school. And so where I really caution this is that when we started going through, and I started going through a lot of the reps to really see who are schools listing as their superintendents. And a lot of times it's becoming the head of the management company and not necessarily the person at the school leader themselves. It's the head of the management company. And so just being aware that whoever it is you're listing as in that, or your school is listing as that school superintendent or that school leader or whoever is in charge, the top dog, I'll say, they should be getting an evaluation. And the MDE has really outlined there's 3 tools that you should be using for that. And management companies have done a really good job shifting over to using one of the approved tools for teachers, but I'm seeing a lag in how they're evaluating the school leaders, and putting on there to be that person of the person who's in charge of the educational leadership of the building.
Right.
And with that, I would just say that I want to make sure that I'm covering all of it. I've actually been in contact with MDE, and we're working with MDE and the Michigan Council of Authorizers to kind of establish a best practices kind of reference document for you to be able to use that will ensure that you're in compliance with this code, and specifically this particular subsection that's listed in the slide that talks about that. Not the principal role, but whoever is that head leadership piece, whoever is in public schools, we call it the superintendent. And in charter schools, God bless us, but we get really crafty and creative with the language we use. But it doesn't matter as to what title you're giving them. That person should be being evaluated using a specific tool, and that tool has to be, and there's very specific language as to what that tool should entail. And I'll speak to that is that right now it's there, like I said, there's 3 tools, and if it's not one of those 3, an entity can use their own, but it has to be incredibly research based, and that whatever you're putting if you're using your own tool to evaluate that person, that research has to be being posted and made available on your school website for transparency and reporting purposes. So if you want to know more about that, or you want to have a more in-depth conversation about those, please reach out, and we can talk about those things. But I just didn't necessarily know if school boards are aware that these Public Act 170 and 173s apply to not just the teachers, not just whoever it is you're listing as that superintendent or that apex of the management of the building itself, or the district, I'll say.
Great. Thanks. Yep. Thanks, Brooke. And just to add to that, so a couple of things to point out and to supplement or augment Brooke's statement. Number one is remember that I think the whole part of the point to this is this becomes a compliance issue, right? So you
Absolutely.
as the board have responsibility to ensure compliance to your charter contract. So if management is out of compliance relative to this particular process or area, then you're out of compliance, or at least your authorizer will see it that way. So it would be in your best interest to probably have further conversation with Brooke to kind of better understand this, but then to ensure that management is using what's expected and required of them for that evaluation piece. And then secondly, Brooke, as I mentioned earlier, the whole notion of school leadership evaluations within the structure of the charter schools movement can get really muddy because of that ESP board relationship. So I would suggest to boards to, especially if you use the Institute's policy service, that you refer to policy on this. You probably do have a policy that tries to outline how this administrator evaluation process should work. And I'll share with you that when I was with the Institute, I oversaw the Institute's board policy service. So we took great care in ensuring when I was there that the administrator evaluation and staff evaluation policies really tried to address that structural relationship, and that all the language within the policy supported that. So second piece is refer to your policy on this, as well as you have ongoing conversation with respect to this subject. Anything else you want to add there, Brooke?
No, I think that's it. And like I said, I'm available if people want to have more, have more in conversations. I am working with MDE and the council. We're reaching out to the council to see if we can come up with something, because this isn't just something that applies to just LSSU charters. This is something that applies across to all charters within Michigan. And so trying to figure out how to do this and be in compliance with the law, but still understanding that we're working with something like with a management and kind of a middleman between that, and how does that work, and who does that, and who is that person. So.
Yeah, very good. Very good. So thank you for that, Brooke. So I'm just going to say that I defend my position with respect to the board's role in the evaluation of school leader. Remember a little bit earlier when I said if the board doesn't employ the school leader or employ staff, it shouldn't necessarily be evaluating them. However, I don't want you to be out of compliance with law either. So I really think we need some final clarity around this whole topic. And I know that the authorizing team at Lake State and the council, as Brooke mentioned, are working hard on this. So stay tuned, right, Brooke?
Well, and I do want to clarify that it does say that it could be their designee, the board's designee, and that designee could be the management company. It's just, I want to have having conversations with that management company of what are the tools they're using to evaluate that leader, and along those lines, because the management companies, like I've done a good job of shifting in the teacher evaluation, how they're evaluating that level of staff, but how are they evaluating the school leaders and who they're putting in that position as the quote unquote superintendent of the district.
Perfect. Yep, thank you. Thank you so much. So finally, as we wrap up, so just a reminder, remember these webinars were scheduled for an hour and a half, and I thought we'd be done a little bit earlier, but I guess not. So one final slide, and this should look familiar to you because this is a slide, one of the first slides that I presented when we talked about the whole notion of relationships in this three-legged stool. So remember, at the end of the day, all three major stakeholders that are involved in this work are really interested in one thing, and that's performance, right? Performance is your stool balancer between and among all three of these entities. And when we talk about evaluating your ESP, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about ensuring performance relative to the school environment, ensuring performance relative to your charter contract, ensuring that the management is performing in accordance with those services that they promised and within those expectations. So this is all about performance. And you see what happens when we're not on the same page. with performance. That tool is tipped. And remember when we talked about this, I told you the reasons is that this whole misunderstanding or not understanding roles, performance expectations, and or accountability. So this whole evaluation conversation really boils up to all three of those understandings, right? So understanding your role is the highest level of leadership for the school. It really comes with it the responsibility of evaluating your employee and or your major contracts like your ESP, articulating those performance expectations as we talked about tonight with respect to those KPIs, and then ensuring that accountability through that monthly reporting relationship and through that formal annual evaluation process. So this was, I think, a good tie into that early webinar that I delivered on those relationships. So I thank you for participating this evening. I look forward to reconvening our session. Our final session will be February 4th, which is, goodness, just a couple of weeks from now, I think. And in that session, we'll be talking about if you think it is ever necessary to initiate a request for proposal process relative to your ESP, what might that process look like? What should I be thinking about relative to that? So that's what we're going to be talking about on February 4th, and you'll see the invitations forthcoming, and we just hope to have all of you gathered then. So final opportunity, not final, but final for this webinar to ask any questions, share any thoughts. I'll give you a minute to do that while you're thinking about those questions, comments, or thoughts. Please, as I've mentioned, don't hesitate to email me, call me, whatever you need to have further conversation, or if there's any other documents within this presentation that you might want copies of, I'm happy to share those. So I'll just wait a minute and see if there are any final questions to ask or any thoughts to share. And just a reminder too that all of the webinars get recorded and they get posted on LSSU's website. So for the February 4th session, for those of you that will not be able to participate, it will be recorded and it will be posted on Lake State's website, just like the others that we've been able to participate in. So I don't see any further questions, but again, if after you've had an opportunity to think about anything that you've heard, you can always follow up by email. Don't hesitate to do that. So I thank all of you again for participating. I look forward to reconvening in a couple of weeks, and have a good, safe, warm evening. Thank you so much.